New details on the Air India crash and new questions about possible sabotage. The confusion in the cockpit.
Air India Flight 171 began like any other routine long-haul journey. A Boeing 787 Dreamliner preparing to carry hundreds of passengers from Ahmedabad to London Gatwick on a clear June morning in 2025, a flight so ordinary on paper that it barely merited attention. Until barely half a minute after liftoff, it became the center of a disaster so haunting, so brutally precise, that investigators would later call it not just a tragic failure, but an unsettling masterpiece of unintended design. As families waved goodbye, business travelers adjusted seat belts, and children peered through cabin windows, the flight crew, veteran professionals with thousands of flight hours logged across continents, conducted the final checks. Engines spooled up, the taxi to runway completed without issue, and the tower cleared them for departure at exactly 10:05 a.m. Witnesses on the ground described the familiar deep rumble of twin engines accelerating into takeoff thrust. Then, chillingly, a sudden thinning of sound, an almost ghostly quiet where thunder should have been, followed by a low, descending arc of the aircraft that ended in a fireball crashing through a student hostel just past the airport perimeter. Within seconds, black smoke and debris painted a scene of devastation few could comprehend. 230 of the 231 souls on board perished instantly, with only one survivor pulled, gravely injured, from the wreckage. On the ground, 19 more lives were lost to fire and falling debris. But it was what followed, the investigation, the cold precision of the data, and the horrifying simplicity of what actually triggered the disaster, that would send shockwave through aviation regulators, cockpit designers, and airline executives alike, exposing a vulnerability so mundane and so easily overlooked that it had persisted for years in the open, waiting for exactly this moment to reveal itself. Almost immediately, the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau of India, supported by Boeing engineers, GE Aerospace, and international regulators including the FAA and EASA, launched a full inquiry, the gravity of which deepened as soon as the black boxes were recovered from the still-smoking wreckage. These devices, designed to survive even the worst impacts, held a second-by-second account of the cockpit's final moments. What they revealed was not a mechanical failure, software glitch, fuel contamination, weather phenomenon, nor the deliberate hand of sabotage, but instead an almost impossible sequence. 3 seconds after rotation, the right engine's fuel control switch abruptly moved from run to cutoff, severing the fuel supply instantly. Just 1 second later, the left engine's identical switch was flipped the same way. Both engines lost thrust in under 2 seconds, and by the time the pilots, caught in confusion and disbelief, pushed the switches back to run about 14 seconds later, it was too late. One engine began to spool up, but the aircraft had already descended fatally. Its momentum lost, the ram air turbine, RAT, deployed automatically as emergency backup, and just 29 seconds after liftoff, the plane slammed into concrete and steel, ending hundreds of lives in an instant. On the cockpit voice recorder, what investigators heard chilled them. Calm voices, trained for crisis, speaking words that hinted at genuine confusion rather than error. "Why did you cut off?" asked one pilot. "I did not," came the stunned reply. There was no panic, no yelling, only incomprehension in the seconds between hope and catastrophe. The pilots had no history of disciplinary action. Toxicology screens came back clean. The aircraft was nearly new, its engines meticulously maintained, the fuel tested and verified free of water or contaminants. All systems had worked exactly as designed. And that was the most frightening revelation. The plane didn't fall from the sky because something failed. It fell because everything worked with lethal perfection the moment those two switches were moved. The investigation spotlight turned to cockpit design, a topic often overshadowed by engines, software, and structures, yet every bit as critical. On the Boeing 787, each engine's fuel control switch is located on the center pedestal console between the captain and first officer, prominently placed for quick access in emergencies or routine startup and shutdown. But unlike other critical levers, such as fire handles that require pulling before turning, these switches were smooth, unguarded, and free to move with a single push. A safety bulletin issued by the FAA in 2018 had already warned of this design's susceptibility to accidental activation, recommending, but crucially, not mandating, that airlines install simple protective guards. Many operators complied, adding small metal covers or recessed housings that prevent the switches from being brushed inadvertently. Others, including Air India's 787 fleet, chose not to, arguing the standard configuration met all certification requirements. And so Flight 171 switches, perfectly legal, perfectly standard, sat exposed that morning, unlocked, unguarded, waiting for a mistake that statistically should never happen, but did. The investigators painstakingly reconstructed the moments of takeoff, pilots' hands moving across the center console, turbulence-induced micromovements, the pressure of checklists and standard calls, all common, unremarkable actions that, in the wrong millisecond, can collide with human anatomy and disaster. The theory that emerged, backed by data, cockpit geometry, and human factors analysis, was that one pilot's hand or forearm brushed the right engine switch during rotation, perhaps while reaching to stow gear or stabilize themselves. The first engine flamed out. Instinctively, the other pilot moved or mirrored the opposite switch, unaware, sealing the aircraft's fate. The horror of this scenario wasn't that it was wildly improbable, but that it was technically possible by design. It revealed that the very layout meant to ensure rapid access in an emergency also made the system vulnerable to the briefest accidental contact. No alarms, no confirmation clicks, just instant shutdown. Once the engines lost thrust at such low altitude and speed, recovery became physically impossible. The fact that one engine began to relight proved the crew's competence and training. They recognized the problem and acted within seconds. But physics, indifferent and brutal, had already taken over. To the public, it sounded unthinkable. How could a billion-dollar, state-of-the-art aircraft be brought down by the simplest movement of a hand? But to aviation safety experts, it was an agonizing reminder that even in the most complex engineered systems, it's often the smallest, most mundane details that open the door to catastrophe. As the investigation advanced, questions of blame turned complex and deeply uncomfortable. The pilots had clean records, acted swiftly, and were never trained for the possibility that those critical switches could be so easily triggered. Air India had complied fully with regulations. Boeing had built to certified design. Yet between the cracks, regulatory recommendations that had no force of law, human factors assessments that underestimated the risk, and cost-benefit choices weighed by operators, the fatal chain remained. Families of the victims, when told, were left grappling with the unbearable, that hundreds died not from terrorism, mechanical failure, or pilot incompetence, but from a foreseeable design vulnerability left unaddressed for years. The draft final report, running hundreds of pages, documented every second, every engineering choice, every regulatory debate that together formed the invisible scaffolding of the disaster. It called out the need for mandatory guards on engine fuel switches, better pilot training on unintentional activation, and an overhaul of certification processes that allowed such a vulnerability to persist. In industry meetings, the tone shifted from shock to reluctant acknowledgement. Yes, it was rare, but once was enough. Beyond technical circles, the cultural impact rippled outward. Memorials rose at the crash site and in London and Ahmedabad, inscribed not just with names but with haunting questions. How could so little stand between life and death? In cockpit design studios and simulator labs, engineers began redrawing panels, adding guards, testing hand movement simulations to catch what might be missed in spreadsheets. For Boeing and global regulators, it wasn't just about the 787 anymore. It was a reckoning with how complex systems can mask simple risks and how compliance can fall short of safety. The final paragraphs of the report, written in precise bureaucratic language, read almost like an epitaph. The accident sequence was initiated by manual movement of engine fuel control switches from run to cutoff during takeoff. Contributing factors included the absence of physical protections against inadvertent activation and reliance on non-mandatory guidance. Beneath those words lay the silent truth that sometimes it is exactly what works as intended that kills. And as Air India Flight 171 became part of history's long list of aviation tragedies, its legacy was neither a mystery nor an unsolved riddle, but something more unsettling, proof that perfection in machinery cannot erase imperfection in human design, and that sometimes the smallest overlooked vulnerability, sitting in plain sight, can write disaster into the sky in the space of 2 seconds. In that realization lay the hardest lesson of all, not just for engineers and regulators, but for a world that wants to believe technology can make us safe forever. That safety isn't just what we build, but what we fail to imagine. And sometimes, even a single switch, left unguarded, can be all that stands between the ordinary and the unthinkable. By the time the investigators started stitching together the last seconds of Air India Flight 171, what emerged wasn't a mystery solved by hidden sabotage, mechanical wreckage, or overlooked alarms. It was something far more chilling. A perfectly modern, fully certified aircraft falling out of the sky because of choices so ordinary and so long known that they'd become invisible. Disturbing details, yes, but even that phrase hardly does justice to what the preliminary report revealed. At the heart of the disaster were 2 engine fuel control switches, positioned on the 787 center console, unguarded, unlabeled beyond the standard markings, waiting for nothing more than a quick flick to tame thrust into silence. No cover, no latch, no second confirmation. Just a smooth toggle, ready to obey without question. And in the cockpit that day, they did, within the span of a single second. The first moved to cutoff, then the second, and just like that, the aircraft's engines lost power. The pilots, stunned, moved them back to run within moments. One engine began to relight, but there wasn't enough altitude left to save them. The Dreamliner, hailed as the pinnacle of modern aviation, fell from 400 feet into a student hostel, killing 230 souls on board and 19 more on the ground. And here's the most unsettling part. Everything functioned exactly as it was supposed to. The engines didn't fail. The sensors didn't lie. The aircraft structure held. The pilots, experienced, sober, recently checked, reacted as trained. The fatal vulnerability wasn't hidden deep in software or metal fatigue. It lay right there in the open, a cockpit design certified as safe but blind to human imperfection. Back in 2018, the FAA itself flagged the risk, warning that critical engine switches on some Boeing aircraft, including the 787, could be flipped unintentionally. The agency issued a safety alert for operators, recommendation only, not requirement, urging airlines to add guards or covers. Some carriers acted. Others, including Air India, didn't. After all, the switches were legal, passed every inspection, and the chance of accidental activation seemed remote. But remote isn't impossible. And in aviation, the price of improbable can be measured in human lives. Boeing offered optional safety upgrades, but in the absence of regulatory push, they weren't widely adopted. The switches that doomed AI-171 were standard issue, exactly as the design manual drew them up, exactly as every certification signed off. That is what makes the tragedy so horrifying. It wasn't an act of sabotage, but a vulnerability in plain sight, known and documented, but not corrected. Even more harrowing is how fast it happened. The right switch flipped 3 seconds after takeoff. 1 second later, the left. Just 2 moments of unintended contact, and everything else, restart attempts, mayday calls, emergency protocols, became a desperate scramble against physics itself. The pilots' voices caught on the cockpit voice recorder were calm, confused rather than panicked. Why did you cut off? I did not. They recognized the engines were dead, acted to recover, but at 400 feet, there was no room. Investigators believe the pilots didn't deliberately shut the engines down. It might have been a stray hand motion, a reflex during turbulence, or a moment of mirrored action. But that's the point. The switches allowed it. And the aircraft, built to obey instantly, complied. In the days after the preliminary report's release, grief turned to anger. Families of the victims, already grappling with loss, read that a modern jet could be felled not by sabotage, not by weather, but by two unprotected switches, and that the risk had been flagged years earlier. Aviation analysts pored over the report. Journalists uncovered pilot complaints about the cockpit layout, and lawmakers demanded to know why optional safety guards remained optional when the cost of installation was trivial compared to the cost of failure. Air India's defense, that the aircraft met all Boeing and DGCA safety protocols, rang hollow, precisely because it was true. Everything had been done by the book, and still, disaster struck. Boeing offered condolences, promised cooperation, but carefully avoided addressing the core question: why did the design allow something so catastrophic to happen with a single flick? Meanwhile, aviation safety groups called for immediate reforms: mandatory guards on all 787 fuel switches, retrofits for older aircraft, and a hard look at cockpit ergonomics that assumes pilots are human, not flawless machines. The FAA came under criticism for stopping at recommendation instead of regulation. Experts pointed out that aviation history is littered with tragedies where systems performed exactly as designed. But the design itself ignored how easily people can make mistakes, especially in high-stress, high-speed moments like takeoff. One grim detail haunts everyone who studies the report. From liftoff to impact took just 29 seconds. In that time, the aircraft went from safe climb to total loss. And in those seconds, every automated safeguard proved useless because the design assumed the switches would never be moved at the wrong time. The unsettling realization isn't just that it happened, but that it could happen again. Dozens of other Dreamliners fly daily with the same layout, the same switches, still unguarded unless airlines voluntarily modified them. And that's the raw wound left by AI 171. It wasn't a technological failure, but a failure of assumption. The belief that rare is good enough. The trust that pilots won't slip, that design flaws can remain if they're statistically unlikely to kill. Now, the question hanging over the final report is as painful as it is simple. Could a single metal guard, a tiny, cheap, retrofittable cover, have saved those lives? As investigators dig deeper into human factors, cockpit ergonomics, and even minor faults noted on the inbound flight, the conclusion seems inescapable. Yes, the aircraft worked, the pilots tried, but the design made a fatal mistake possible. And that possibility turned real, costing 249 lives in total. It exposes an industry dilemma few want to admit: that compliance isn't the same as safe, and that human error must be anticipated, not wished away. Families demand accountability, experts demand redesign, and regulators face pressure to act where recommendation failed. Because this crash wasn't random. It wasn't unforeseeable. It was a risk known, warned about, and left in the sky, until the wrong second, on the wrong day, turned possibility into tragedy. And unless that changes, AI 171 won't be the last time a fully functional, expertly flown jet falls not from malfunction, but from the blind spot between human error and design that refuses to expect it. That is the most disturbing detail of all.